Nix's mate, 2 a.m. with Keats. So thank you for joining us, Eileen, here on Poet to Poet, Writer Writer. Now, I was looking around and I saw on your website you used a quote by Neruda, and it says poetry is an act of peace. And especially in our times now, even more so. And I know you work as a very stressful job as a nurse. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Can you tell me how is poetry therapeutic for you, or I mean, is it calming for you? Are you able to write poetry in these days? You know,
I have been writing a little bit during these times. I've mostly been writing poems that what I'm calling from Missing Odysseus, sort of the characters in Odysseus who have been missing him before he returns, and it's sort of an escape from the world of today and having to really be in the present. So that's good.
What kind of nursing do you do? Just out of interest.
I'm a hospice nurse.
Oh, okay. All
yeah.
right. Okay.
Yeah.
But even you're shocked by this, even though being an experienced hospice nurse, this whole situation, I'm sure is.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in the child ward of the Commonwealth, you speak of your really sort of horror times experience as a foster child. Dennis Daly pointed out in his review that confessional poetry is difficult enough to write, but through the eyes of a maturing adult, poetry becomes magic and medicinal. So, did you have both? Did you experience both qualities? Was it medicinal or was it, magical? What would you say?
I think that there's probably a little bit of each. I know that I wrote for years not knowing what I was writing about until I could admit to myself what I needed to write. And that was a pretty magical time in terms of freeing myself to write. And then I think all poetry in some ways is medicinal.
Okay.
Yeah.
You explore the sort of who's moving around there a lot. Because we're getting a lot of interference. Someone eating crackers or something like that. Okay, please. All right. So, you explore the heartbreaking transient lifestyle you led as a foster child. And I remember the line, "The real share their dinner in the other room." I think that says a lot about your whole life as a foster child, being the other and not being in any group or being an extra, not being essential. I mean, that's recurrent theme, right?
Yes.
Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, I think a lot of my poetry in that book speaks to the desire to belong to a group and to be, less of an outsider. And I think I didn't realize when I first started writing poetry that was what I was writing about. I'd write these beautiful little lyrical poems about zoos and animals and nature, and really because those animals sort of belonged with one another and the trees belonged with one another, but I didn't know that yet, why I was writing, what the impulse for those poems was.
So it's almost sort of like your automatic writing.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah. And then I think, so there's some freedom and I hope that, I would imagine that the feeling of wanting to belong is a pretty usual feeling for anyone who's had their family disrupted in that way. And so I was hoping to give voice to that for those people who maybe don't write, but maybe can find it in the reading.
How painful was it for you, to write this, I was reading some of the really hard things that went on in some of these families. I mean, how painful was it for you to write? I mean, they say from great pain comes great art. Certainly you had enough of the pain, right?
Yeah. It was extremely painful. And there were times when I needed to step back and stop writing for a while. It was very important to me that the authentic feeling came into the poems, but in order to do that, I had to take very good care of myself and make sure that I took care of myself physically and mentally, and relied on my friends and family, and yeah.
And not wind up like all the other confessional poets, like Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton and Robert Lowell and all that, right? Keep yourself together.
Right. Exactly.
I mean, would you define yourself as a confessional poet? You don't want to be, there are other aspects of your writing.
Right. I mean, I never did define myself as a confessional poet. I don't know if that's because I've heard it used as I've heard it used as like a mark of slander sometimes by other poets. But really, I guess any poetry that confesses a lyrical impulse is a confessional poem. And really, in the end, labels don't matter. I'm trying very hard to create some type of art or transcendence or something else out of trauma, and also out of other life experience. So I hope what I'm doing is transcending that and making art. And I don't know what to call it exactly.
Good poetry. You founded the Lily Poetry Review. Tell us about the genesis of this, the idea.
Well, when I was working at Carve magazine as the assistant poetry editor, I saw a lot of poems, obviously hundreds and hundreds of poems, that probably deserved to be published. And I'm widely read, and so I appreciate all forms of poetry. And I just didn't think there was enough room in that magazine for all the poems I wanted to see in the world. And I know there's no shortage of beautiful work. And I thought, the other thing is I wanted to be the editor of a poetry journal. And, there's not too many people knocking on the doors of 50-year-old nurses to head up their established journals. So I said, if this is a door I want to enter, I'm going to need to make it. And so we started the Lily Poetry Review, and with the simple mission of publishing great poems and providing a venue for people's voices and of really high quality and a wide aesthetic, and to promote literary citizenship. And that's what we hope to do.
Yeah, and I appreciate your literary citizenship, because I try to do that too, and I appreciate people who do that. It's not about you. So I was going to ask you, could you share some of your poetry with us? read from some of your work. Yeah.
Sure. Maybe I'll start with a poem I wrote for my hospice patients. I've written quite a few, but I'll read one.
Okay.
Which is called Silence. And I wrote this in Portland, Oregon. Silence. Cherry blossoms line the Saturday market near Burnside. Back home, winter plants its yellow shovels by the bulkhead. I'm on holiday from hospice work, except for the ghosts in my luggage, who say little, who are thin. I've carried Bob for 5 years since he stopped loading sawed oaks into his pickup to fashion roll-top desks for the Elder Center. His heart gave out, not before his wife ignored her headaches until the clot blocked the gate to her thoughts where he used to live. No one could forget that sterile Wednesday by her post-stroke bed as she wept and said, "For the love of God, go away, you're dead." What could he do? Bob slipped off like the carrots on his wife's weighted spoon, which never could hold things in place. I had to scavenge bits of nature which Bob would have given a second life, and to the cruelty-free shrine beside the knitted hats that might keep us all a bit warmer, listening hard for the right prayer to lift into the atmosphere while the living and the dead watch ants sprinkle the sidewalks and bridges, make hallways of the clouds.
Wow. I mean, you must have a lot of fodder from your work.
Yes.
I mean, yeah. Go read some more. Read a couple more. A gentleman wants to ask a question. Maybe I'll let him ask that question, then you can read some more work.
Sure. That sounds good.
Art Zilero. Hello.
Sure. Just had to unmute myself. Sorry for the delay.
Yeah.
Okay, Eileen. So the question I posted in the chat is, the idea of using childhood trauma as the raw material for aesthetic and personal transcendence was central to Wordsworth's poetics. Do you consider Wordsworth specifically or Romanticism in general to be an influence on your own work?
I do. In fact, there's a poem that's in Child Ward of the Commonwealth, which has nothing to do with Wordsworth, but it started out as a poem very similar to one of his, and it's a hunger poem about a time in my life that involved us not eating very much, sometimes for days without eating. And it doesn't sound anything like a Wordsworth poem, but it started out in my mind like one. And I needed that vehicle. I needed to escape into his type of writing, kind of write that poem and then step back and face it and write it in my own way. So it was helpful. And I find that a lot when I'm reading other poets, that I can use their words to inspire my own, or their bravery or their sensibilities to inspire my own. Yeah.
That answer your question. Okay. Let's have you read some more work from your work.
Okay. Yeah. I think I'll just read a few poems about foster care. And then maybe the title poem to Child Ward of the Commonwealth. Mm-hmm. Foster kid. Ask her name and where she lives. She answers Burke, Fitzpatrick, Shaughnessy, old family, new family, wake up, we're home in Rockland, Salem, Braintree. Her brothers, gone or born last week, mothers, aunties or ma'ams. Leanie slurps noodles straight from a pan, stuffs liverwurst through porch slats, swallows meatloaf, thin sliced and too fast, while the reals share dinner in the next room. She's 4, 7, or just turned 10, never an only, mostly an extra, always between. In the next town over, it's October again.
So all this transience, is certainly unnerving for a kid. And now we're all, now you have a permanent home. Is that, that's sort of the answer to your childhood dilemma, right? You have a home, and you have a place, you have a community.
Yes. And, I wish I could have told that child that one day this would be the case. Yeah. I often think about that. And it provides me a lot of hope for any time when there's a crisis, or anytime I see anyone going through something. I say there is a tomorrow, there is a better future.
I was going to ask you, they always ask this in the New York Times book review, but I mean, I figure it's a good question. Why should we read your work, you think, if I ask you that?
It's a good question.
I don't know. The New York Times came up with it, so I can't take credit.
I think you should read my work for the same reason you should read as much work by writers as possible, because we are all writing for one another, and we can all find ourselves in one another's work. Yeah.
Okay. Does anyone have questions for Eileen? No? Okay. Well, how about another poem?
Okay.
All right.
I'm going to read a poem that concerns my brother, Carl, who we went for many, many years not knowing what happened to him after the day that our family dissembled. He was 2 years old, and we never got to see him again. Okay. On my 2-year-old brother gone missing. Not his ride-on pony, but its print on the grass. Galloping white space, gathering its fields. Nicker whisper, thunder, burned. Once, at Angelo's grocery, I reached for a small boy. Niobe, at least, had a corpse for each. We thought perhaps Rhode Island or a border town nearby, but the stars on his face haven't mapped his way back. Turn off the afternoon, then the sky.
I was going to ask you, what is the new book going to be about?
Oh,
is my voice coming out bad?
It is.
Yeah.
No, it's fine.
It's fine? Okay. Yeah. Hi, Faye. How are you?
My new book is 2 a.m. with Keats. And when my dear friend Lucy Brock-Broido passed away, I missed her terribly, and I kept hearing, I kept interpreting signs as if she were coming to see me. Not, of course, cognitively as if I were hallucinating or anything, but just spiritually. I have I had a broken screen door hinge, and every time that rattled, I thought she might be coming to reassure me. And I just missed her terribly. So what I started to do was study John Keats in depth. And I kind of had a conversation with all of his sonnets. And in that way, I was talking to her. And so I'm up most nights anyway, working as a nurse. So between 2 and 3 a.m., I would read the sonnets pretty religiously and talk to both John Keats and Lucy in response to them. And so that the very long poem in the book, it's almost a book-length poem, is called 2 a.m. with Keats, and their responses to the sonnets in little tiny couplets and tercets. And then the rest of the book concerns a few elegies for Lucy and some elegies for John Keats.
Did you study with her?
I was more of a companion than somebody who studied with her, although she did read my poems and comment on them. But so I had a few times at her table in Cambridge, you know, the Sargent Street Gang, a terrific group of poets who studied with her for years, and they're all very gifted, beautiful humans. But then I also spent a great deal of time with her, not at the table, but just in life. And I learned more from that, I think, than any other experience in poetry, I would say.
Okay. Anyone want to have a question for our guest today?
I have a question.
Where can you purchase your book? Child Ward of
the Commonwealth. Yeah, it's available through Main Street Rag Bookstore.
Okay.
And of course, I think it's on my website too. I could send signed copies. Actually have so many of them that I could probably toss them out like frisbees if anybody wants one.
Yeah.
But, yeah. But yeah.
Okay. Well, if no one has any questions for our guest, I'll say thank you very much for the experience.
There's a question.
Thank you.
Oh, there's a question. Here we go.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Hi, Faye.
I can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Eileen, hi. It's
Hi.
so enjoyable to hear you read.
Thank you.
How do you know when a poem is finished, Eileen?
Oh, I have such a hard time with that. If anybody would let me, I'd work on the same poem my whole life.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that sometimes I don't send out work very often because it's never finished in my estimation.
It never is finished. I remember interviewing Robert Creeley years ago, and he told me that the poem is never finished. He didn't like revising, though. And so what he said, if he didn't like the poem, he'd just throw it in the trash can. He wouldn't revise it, and that's it. Most poets revise stuff like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
I have a question. Can you talk a little bit more about your project with Odysseus?
Yeah, I'm just looking at the lesser written about characters like Laertes and Argos and those characters who have been missing him for those 20 years while he's gone. And so I think of Argos, thrown away in the mule yard, forced to kind of be with the cows where he was used to be a distinguished beast hunter of, and he had his own really amazing accomplishments as a dog, but then he's, relegated to the mule yard after Odysseus leaves, but he never stops listening for him. And so I wrote kind of a broken villanelle for him. And then Laertes, the father, just kind of an offering of peace and hope for him in terms of listening to the orchard, because the orchard might bring his son back. Because if you remember, at one point when Laertes and Odysseus, when Odysseus was a boy, they planted a lot of fig trees and pear trees and things together, and Odysseus was scarred, I think on his leg, by one of them. So then just sort of reminding him how he would know his boy when he returned, that sort of thing.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
I do.
Yeah, good.
Jennifer.
Hi, Doug. Hi, Eileen. I'm really looking forward to your next book. And it's a comment/question that I had. And I hope I don't break down crying. Your book just moves me in so many ways. It's so beautiful. But what I especially loved, one of the many things, is how it transformed into, I guess, Leanie as the adult, and how this, was a book about transformations. I know that word is overused. And as you came to the end of the book, and it's Leanie as the nurse and the healer, this is where Lucy started to come in, and all the different transformations, and the deer, and I just, it was so, for many reasons, I found it very moving. Were you starting, though, to write your second book by the end of that? I find that so often projects can sort of begin in one place and then, become another whole other book. But
Yeah.
I love that whole movement.
Yeah. Well, Ian Haley Pollock had read the book before it was published and advised me. And we were talking back and forth about how would we bring the adult into the book.
Mm.
But then, after the book was accepted and Lucy got very sick.
Mm.
And I was mourning her before she died. And so the book, the elegy for Lucy at the end with the minnows and the beloved sphinxes, those poems, even the potatoes, their various moods came from that experience. And I thought that was appropriate, that because I did find a home in Lucy in so many ways. And we found a home in one another, in each other. And so it seemed right that she would be there at the end. And I feel like it's the same way I feel about Manny Iyer and Needham, which is that they've been there all along. We just didn't know one another yet. But yeah, I thought, that, and yes, I guess to answer your question, I kept writing about that afterwards, and that became my second book.
Yeah. Anyone else? Well, someone who's here actually in the audience, is the new poet laureate of Amesbury, I believe, Eileen O'Leary, right?
Ellie.
What?
Ellie O'Leary.
Ellie O'Leary.
Yeah, Eileen is Eileen. I'm Ellie.
Oh, okay. I got you. I got confused. But anyway,
the
you're going
names
to be
are very similar. Yeah.
So you're going to be our next guest on Poet to Poet, and I know you know my good friend Lainey Seneschal.
I do.
And Harris Gardner. Yeah. So you got to send me some information and stuff. Okay. Some signature
I'm just
poems.
making a list. I'm also here today, just sort of like watching because I know I'm up next and I doing my homework.
Yeah. Okay.
That's what I was doing this morning, watching Doug's interviews from previous guests.
Right.
That's right. I don't think they're tough. Anyway, thank you all for joining me on Poet to Poet, Writer to Writer, and I hope. And you're scheduled Monday, right, Ellie?
Yeah, right. Monday at 3. Yeah.
Monday at 3. So we'll and then I hope to have this, the TV station will broadcast this as well. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Poet.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eileen.
Bye, Eileen. Bye, Doug.
Bye now. Bye.
Great to see you.
Good to see you.